When the flood came to Red Hollow, the town that had cursed Wyatt Mercer's name for years watched him ride straight into the jaws of death to save them. But 3 weeks earlier, he had been nothing more than the most hated man in the valley, and Clara Voss had been a desperate stranger with nowhere left to turn. What happened between a discarded bride and a feared outcast in those few short weeks would rewrite both their lives forever. If you want to see how this story ends, stay with me until the final word, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The train shuddered to a halt at Red Hollow, just as the sun began its descent behind the ragged peaks of the western mountains. Clara Voss stepped onto the platform with a carpetbag that held everything she owned in the world, which was almost nothing. A worn dress, a change of underclothes, a hairbrush with 3 missing teeth, and a small photograph of her mother, long dead. That was it. That was all that remained after the man who promised to marry her had vanished with her savings, her dignity, and every foolish hope she'd carried across 2 states to meet him. The platform was empty except for a weathered station master who glanced at her once, then looked away as if she were invisible. Clara tightened her grip on the carpetbag and stepped into the dusty street. Red Hollow was larger than she'd expected. 2 rows of buildings facing each other like boxers squaring off, a church with a crooked steeple at one end, a saloon with broken shutters at the other. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a woman laughed, sharp and cold. Clara's boots crunched against the dirt as she walked toward the center of town. She had 47 cents in her pocket. That was enough for maybe one night's lodging if she could find a boarding house that didn't ask questions. After that, she'd need work. Any work. She wasn't proud anymore. Pride had died somewhere between St. Louis and the empty train platform where Thomas Crawford was supposed to be waiting with a ring and a future. The general store was still open. Clara pushed through the door and a bell jangled overhead. The man behind the counter looked up, middle-aged, mustache like a push broom, eyes that measured her worth in half a second. "Help you?" he asked. "I'm looking for work," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I can clean, cook, mend, anything you need." The man's gaze drifted to her left hand. No ring, then to her face, no husband waiting outside, then to the carpetbag. No prospects. "Not hiring," he said. "I'm a hard worker. I don't need much. Just enough to—" "I said we're not hiring." His tone had gone flat. Final. Clara swallowed the pleading words that wanted to spill out. She nodded once and turned toward the door. Behind her, she heard the man mutter something to someone else in the back room. Laughter followed her into the street. She tried the seamstress next. A tight-lipped woman opened the door just wide enough to look Clara up and down. "Do you need help with—" "No." The door shut. The boarding house, the bakery, the laundry. Every door in Red Hollow seemed to close a little faster than the one before. By the time the sun touched the mountains, Clara had walked the entire length of the town twice and had been turned away from every establishment that might have offered her a chance. Her feet ached, her throat was dry, and the 47 cents in her pocket felt heavier with every step, like a countdown to disaster. She found herself standing in front of a small church. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old wood and candle wax. Clara sank into the back pew and let her carpetbag drop to the floor. For the first time since stepping off the train, she let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. Thomas had been a lie. The future had been a lie. And now she was alone in a town that didn't want her, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. She didn't cry. She'd run out of tears 2 days ago, somewhere in Kansas. Instead, she sat in the silence and tried to think. She could sell the photograph. No, that was madness. It was worth nothing to anyone but her. She could try begging. No, not yet. Not while she still had 2 working hands and a spine that hadn't bent. She could leave on the next train, but there was no next train until Thursday, and she didn't have enough money to wait 3 days without food or shelter. The light through the windows turned orange, then red, then purple. Clara closed her eyes and made herself breathe. In and out, steady. She would figure this out. She had to. When she stepped back outside, the street had changed. The shops were closed now, shutters drawn, lamps extinguished. But the saloon at the far end of town was alive with noise, rough voices, stomping boots, the bright clash of a piano played by someone who didn't care about the tune. Clara stood in the shadows across the street and watched. Men pushed through the swinging doors, some laughing, some stumbling. Women in bright dresses leaned against the porch railing, calling out to passers-by. Clara had never been inside a saloon. Her mother would have fainted at the thought, but her mother was dead, and Clara was out of options. She crossed the street. The noise hit her like a wall the moment she stepped through the doors. Smoke, whiskey, sweat, and something sharper underneath. Desperation, maybe, or violence waiting for an excuse. Men crowded around tables, cards in hand, coins glinting. The bartender was a thick-shouldered man with a scar running from his ear to his jaw. He glanced at Clara, frowned, and went back to pouring drinks. Clara moved toward the bar, trying to look like she belonged. She didn't. Every eye in the room found her within seconds. The piano player stopped mid-chord. Conversation stuttered and fell silent. "You lost, girl?" One man called out. Laughter rippled through the room. Clara lifted her chin. "I'm looking for work." More laughter. Someone whistled. "What kind of work?" Another voice asked, low and mean. "I can cook. Clean. I'm good with numbers. I can keep books if you need." "We got all the help we need," the bartender said. His tone wasn't cruel, just tired. "You should go." Clara opened her mouth to argue, to beg, to do something, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't going to budge. None of them were. She turned toward the door, her face burning, her chest tight with a humiliation so deep it felt like drowning. And then the saloon door swung open, and the room went silent. A man stepped inside. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark wool and worn leather. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but Claire could see the hard line of his jaw, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the cold, pale eyes that swept the room like a predator scanning for threats. He moved with the kind of stillness that made noise seem vulgar. Every man in the saloon took a step back without realizing it. Wyatt Mercer. Clara didn't know his name yet, but she felt the weight of it in the air. The bartender set down his rag. The piano player studied his hands. No one spoke. Wyatt walked to the bar, his boots striking the floor with steady, deliberate weight. He didn't look at Clara. He didn't look at anyone. He simply existed in the space, and the space bent around him. "Whiskey," he said. His voice was low, rough, like gravel under a wagon wheel. The bartender poured without a word and slid the glass across the bar. Wyatt picked it up, drank it in one swallow, and set the glass down with a soft clink. Then he turned to leave. Clara didn't plan what happened next. She didn't think. She just moved. She stepped directly into his path. Wyatt stopped. His eyes dropped to her face, and for a moment Clara forgot how to breathe. Up close, he was even more intimidating, taller than she'd thought, harder, with a gaze that seemed to strip away every lie and see straight through to the marrow. But she didn't step aside. "I need help," she said. The room held its breath. Wyatt's expression didn't change. "Not my problem." "I have nowhere to go, no money, no work. I'll do anything, cleaning, cooking, mending, I don't need much. Just a roof and a meal." "Then find someone else." "I tried. No one will hire me." "Still not my problem." He stepped around her and headed for the door. Clara's desperation flared into something hotter, sharper. "Please." Her voice cracked on the word, and she hated herself for it, but she didn't stop. "I'm not asking for charity. I'll work. I'll earn it. Just give me a chance." Wyatt paused at the door, his hand on the frame. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he turned his head just enough to look at her over his shoulder. "You got a name?" "Clara Voss." "Why are you here, Clara Voss?" She could have lied. She could have softened it, made it sound better than it was. But something in his eyes told her he'd see through it. "I came here to marry a man who stole my money and disappeared." Wyatt studied her for another beat. Then he pushed through the door and walked into the street. Clara stood there, fists clenched, humiliation and rage and exhaustion warring inside her chest. The men in the saloon started laughing again. The piano started playing. She'd failed. Again. But then the door swung open. Wyatt stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light. "You hungry?" Clara blinked. "What?" "I asked if you're hungry." She nodded slowly, not trusting her voice. Come on then. He turned and walked toward the diner across the street. Clara grabbed her carpetbag and followed, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. The diner was small and dim, lit by oil lamps that threw soft shadows across the walls. Wyatt sat at a corner table, his back to the wall, his eyes on the door. Clara sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her carpetbag at her feet. A woman in a stained apron brought them plates of stew, bread, and coffee without being asked. She didn't speak to Wyatt. No one did. Clara ate slowly, forcing herself not to gulp it down like an animal. The stew was thin but warm, and the bread was fresh enough to still be soft in the middle. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite hit her stomach. Wyatt didn't eat. He just sat there, watching her with that unreadable expression, his coffee untouched. "Why are you helping me?" Clara asked finally. "Haven't decided if I am yet." "Then why buy me supper?" "You looked like you needed it." Clara set down her spoon. "I don't want pity." "Good. I don't give it." She met his eyes. "Then what do you want?" Wyatt leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her face. "You said you'd work." "I will." "Cleaning? Cooking?" "Yes." "Can you mend clothes, fix things that are broken?" "Yes." "Can you keep your mouth shut when you're told to?" Clara hesitated. "If I need to." Wyatt's mouth almost twitched. Almost. "I live about 6 miles north of here, up in the hills. The cabin's small, it's rough. There's no neighbors, no town, no easy way out if you change your mind. I need someone to keep the place running while I'm working. You do that, I'll give you a roof, meals, and a wage. Small, but fair." Clara stared at him. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance. You screw it up, you're gone. No second warnings." "Why me?" "Because you asked." It was the simplest answer in the world, and yet it hit Clara like a fist to the chest. She'd been turned away by everyone in this town, and the one man they all feared had listened. "When do I start?" she asked. "Now." Wyatt stood, dropped a few coins on the table, and walked toward the door. Clara grabbed her carpetbag and hurried after him. Outside, the street was dark except for the glow from the saloon. Wyatt's horse was tied to a post near the edge of town, a big black gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. Wyatt untied the reins and swung into the saddle with practiced ease. Then he looked down at Clara. "You ever ridden before?" "A little. When I was younger." "Good enough." He offered her his hand. Clara took it, and he pulled her up behind him in one smooth motion. She settled onto the horse's back, her carpetbag clutched awkwardly in one arm, her other hand gripping the edge of Wyatt's coat. "Hold on," he said. Then he spurred the horse forward, and they rode into the night. The trail north was narrow and steep, winding through scrub and rock under a sky so thick with stars, it looked like someone had spilled salt across black velvet. Clara had never seen so many stars. In the city, the lights drowned them out. But here, out in the wild, they blazed. Wyatt didn't speak. He rode with the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing the land like the back of his hand. Clara held on and tried not to think about what she was doing, riding into the wilderness with a man she didn't know, to a place she'd never seen, with no way back if things went wrong. But what choice did she have? Red Hollow had made it clear she wasn't wanted. At least Wyatt had given her a chance. The cabin appeared suddenly, a dark shape against the hillside. It was small, just like he'd said. One room, a stone chimney, a narrow porch. Wyatt dismounted and helped Clara down, then led the horse to a small lean-to behind the cabin. "Wait inside," he said. "I'll be a minute." "Yes, sir." Clara climbed the porch steps and pushed open the door. The interior was dark. She fumbled for a match, found one on a shelf near the door, and lit the lamp hanging from a hook on the wall. The light revealed a space that was spare but not unkempt. A bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs near the hearth, shelves lined with tins and jars, a stack of firewood by the door. Everything was orderly, clean, but there was a coldness to it, a sense that no one had lived here in a long time, only survived. Wyatt stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He took off his hat and hung it on a peg, then moved to the hearth and began building a fire. Clara watched him work, efficient, methodical, no wasted motion. "There's a cot in the back corner," he said without looking at her. "You'll sleep there. I'll take the bed. You wake at dawn, get the fire going, make breakfast. After that, I'll show you what needs doing." "All right. And Clara," she looked at him, "don't go into town without telling me first. Don't talk to people about me. And if anyone asks why you're here, you tell them you work for me. Nothing more." "Why?" Wyatt straightened, his eyes hard. "Because I said so." Clara nodded slowly. She wanted to ask more. Why he lived alone. Why people feared him. Why he'd helped her when no one else would. But the look on his face told her those questions wouldn't be answered tonight. "Thank you," she said quietly. Wyatt didn't respond. He just turned back to the fire, and Clara made her way to the cot in the corner. She set down her carpet bag, pulled off her boots, and lay down fully clothed. The cot was narrow and the blanket was thin, but it was more than she'd had an hour ago. As the fire crackled and the warmth began to fill the cabin, Clara closed her eyes and let herself breathe. She'd made it through the first day. Tomorrow, she'd prove she could handle the rest. And somewhere across the room, Wyatt Mercer sat in the firelight, staring into the flames, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Mason. Clara woke to the sound of boots on the porch. The cabin was still dark, the fire reduced to embers. She sat up, disoriented, her body stiff from the unfamiliar cot. Through the window, she could see the faintest hint of gray light on the horizon. Dawn. She threw off the blanket, pulled on her boots, and hurried to the hearth. The fire was nearly dead. She grabbed kindling from the stack, coaxed the embers back to life, and added larger pieces of wood until the flames caught and held. By the time Wyatt stepped inside, the cabin was warming and the coffee pot was on the grate. He glanced at the fire, then at her. "Good." That was all he said. But Clara felt a small surge of pride anyway. Wyatt moved to the shelves and pulled down a tin of oats, a jar of dried apples, and a small crock of honey. He set them on the table without a word. Clara took the hint. She made porridge, thick and sweet, and poured 2 cups of coffee. They ate in silence. When the meal was finished, Wyatt stood and motioned for her to follow him outside. The morning air was cold and sharp, scented with pine and earth. The cabin sat on a slope overlooking a narrow valley, with hills rising on all sides. It was beautiful in a raw, unforgiving way. No softness, no compromise, just stone and sky, and the hard truth of survival. Wyatt led her to the lean-to where the horse stood, already saddled. Beside it was a small vegetable garden overgrown with weeds. Beyond that, a chicken coop, half the boards missing. "The garden needs clearing," Wyatt said. "The coop needs fixing. The clothes need mending." He pointed to a pile of fabric near the porch. "There's a root cellar behind the cabin. Check the stores, see what's low. Make a list." Clara nodded, committing it all to memory. "I'll be gone most of the day," Wyatt continued. "I'm working a herd about 10 miles east. I'll be back before dark. You need anything, it'll have to wait." "I'll be fine." Wyatt studied her for a moment, as if weighing whether to believe her. Then he swung into the saddle and rode down the trail without looking back. Clara stood there until he disappeared from view. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The garden was worse than it looked. The weeds had taken over completely, choking out whatever had been planted there. Clara pulled them by the roots, her hands quickly blistering, her back aching. But she didn't stop. She cleared row after row, piling the weeds in a heap to be burned later. By midday, her hands were raw and bleeding. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from an old shirt she found in the cabin and kept going. The chicken coop took longer. The boards were rotted through in places, the nails rusted. Clara scavenged what she could from a pile of scrap wood behind the cabin and did her best to patch the gaps. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. She checked the root cellar next. The stores were low, just a few sacks of potatoes, some dried beans, and a handful of withered carrots. She made a list in her head: flour, salt, sugar, cornmeal, lard. By the time the sun began its descent, Clara had cleared the garden, patched the coop, mended 3 shirts, and scrubbed the cabin floor until it gleamed. Her body screamed in protest, but her mind felt clear for the first time in weeks. She'd done something. She'd earned her place. at least for one more day. She was pulling bread from the oven when she heard the horse outside. Wyatt stepped into the cabin, dusty and tired, and stopped short when he saw the table set with bread, beans, and the last of the dried apples stewed in honey. His gaze swept the room, the clean floor, the mended clothes folded on the shelf, the fire burning steady and warm. He didn't say anything. He just sat down at the table, and Clara served him without a word. They ate in silence. When the meal was finished, Wyatt leaned back in his chair and looked at her. "You did good today." It was the first compliment Clara had heard in months, and it hit her harder than she expected. She nodded, her throat suddenly tight. "Thank you." Wyatt stood and carried his plate to the wash basin. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's the same." Clara cleaned the dishes, banked the fire, and lay down on the cot. Her body ached, her hands stung, but she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt like she mattered. So, the days fell into a rhythm. Clara woke before dawn, built the fire, made breakfast. Wyatt left for work, and she spent the day cleaning, mending, tending the garden, and fixing whatever was broken. When he returned at dusk, she had a meal waiting. They ate in silence, and then the night closed in around them. But slowly, in small, barely noticeable ways, things began to shift. Wyatt started teaching her how to read the weather by the shape of the clouds, how to find edible roots in the rocky soil, how to listen to the way the wind moved through the trees and know if a storm was coming. He didn't explain why he was teaching her these things. He just did. And Clara learned. She proved herself again and again. When a fence broke, she fixed it. When the roof leaked, she patched it. When supplies ran low, she rationed without complaint. She endured the cold, the loneliness, the relentless work, and she never asked for more than he'd promised. Wyatt noticed. He started lingering at the table after meals, nursing his coffee, watching her clean up. He started talking, not much, just a sentence here, a comment there. The weather, the herd, the way the land changed with the seasons. Small things, but they were something. One evening, as Clara set a fresh tablecloth on the table, one she'd mended and washed until it looked almost new, Wyatt reached out and touched the edge of it. "My mother made this," he said quietly. Clara froze. It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother, the first time he'd mentioned anyone. "She had good hands," Clara said carefully. Wyatt's jaw tightened. She did. He didn't say more, but Clara understood. This cabin, this life. It had belonged to someone else once, someone who had filled it with warmth and care. And when that person was gone, Wyatt had kept the space intact but let the life drain out of it. Until now. Clara started adding small touches, a jar of wildflowers on the table, a cushion on the chair, the smell of bread baking in the morning. She wasn't trying to replace what had been lost, she was just trying to bring a little light back into the shadows. And Wyatt, who had spent years keeping the world at arm's length, found himself letting her in. 3 weeks after Clara arrived, she finally rode into town. Wyatt had given her a list: flour, salt, coffee, thread, and enough money to cover it. He'd also given her a warning. "People will talk. Let them. Don't defend me. Don't explain. Just get what we need and come back." Clara had nodded, but she hadn't understood. Not really. She understood now. The moment she walked into the general store, the shopkeeper's eyes narrowed. "You're the one staying with Mercer," he said. "I work for him." "That what he's calling it?" Clara's face flushed, but she kept her voice steady. "I need flour, salt, coffee, and thread." The shopkeeper didn't move. "You know what he did, don't you?" "I know he gave me work when no one else would. He killed a man." The words hung in the air like smoke. Clara's heart stuttered, but she forced herself to meet the shopkeeper's eyes. "That's not my business." "It is if you're living with him. I'm working for him. Now, are you going to sell me what I need, or do I have to go somewhere else?" The shopkeeper glared at her for a long moment, then turned and started pulling items from the shelves. He slammed them onto the counter one by one. "People are going to talk," he muttered. "Let them." Clara paid, gathered her supplies, and walked out with her head high. But her hands were shaking. Outside, she leaned against the storefront and tried to steady her breath. Wyatt had killed a man. The town believed it. They hated him for it, and Clara had just defended him without even knowing the truth. She rode back to the cabin in silence, the supplies tied to the saddle, her mind spinning. When she arrived, Wyatt was chopping wood behind the cabin. He looked up as she dismounted, his eyes searching her face. "They talked," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "What did they say?" Clara hesitated, then she met his gaze. "They said you killed someone." Wyatt's expression didn't change. He sank the axe into the stump and wiped his hands on his trousers. "And what do you think?" Clara studied him, the hard lines of his face, the scars he carried, the steady way he met her eyes without flinching. "I think," she said slowly, "that if you wanted to hurt me, you would have done it by now." Wyatt's jaw tightened. For a moment, he looked like he might say something, but then he just picked up the axe and went back to chopping wood. Clara carried the supplies inside and put them away. She didn't ask for the truth, and Wyatt didn't offer it. But that night, as they sat across from each other at the table, something had shifted between them. Clara had chosen to trust him, and Wyatt, for the first time in years, had let someone see past the walls he'd built. Neither of them knew it yet, but that choice would change everything. The truth came to Clara in pieces, like shards of broken glass she had to fit together in the dark. It started 3 days after her trip to town, when Wyatt came back from the eastern pastures with blood on his shirt and a gash across his forearm that needed stitching. He'd said nothing about it, just washed his hands at the pump and sat down at the table like it was nothing. Clara had seen the wound when he reached for his coffee, the sleeve pulling back to reveal torn flesh and fresh blood. "Let me see that," she'd said, already reaching for the needle and thread she kept in the mending basket. "It's fine." "It's not fine. Sit still." Wyatt had looked at her with that unreadable expression he wore like armor, but he hadn't pulled away when she rolled up his sleeve and cleaned the wound with whiskey. Her hands were steady as she threaded the needle, steadier than they'd been in weeks. She'd stitched torn fabric 100 times. Skin wasn't so different, just softer, warmer, more alive under her fingers. "Where'd you learn to do this?" Wyatt asked as she worked. "My mother was a nurse during the war. She taught me." "Good teacher." She was. Clara pulled the thread tight, knotted it, and cut the excess with her sewing scissors. "How'd this happen?" "Caught it on barbed wire." Clara didn't believe him. The cut was too clean, too deliberate. But she didn't press. She wrapped his arm in clean cloth and tied it off. "Change the bandage tomorrow," she said, "and keep it clean." Wyatt had nodded, his eyes on her face. "You're good at this." "I've had practice." That night, after Wyatt had gone to bed, Clara sat by the fire and thought about the way he'd flinched when she'd touched the wound. Not from pain, but from something else. Like he wasn't used to being cared for. Like kindness was a language he'd forgotten how to speak. She was beginning to understand that Wyatt Mercer wasn't a man who'd been broken by one terrible thing. He was a man who'd been worn down by 1,000 small cruelties, day after day, until he'd learned to expect nothing and need no one. But Clara was still here, and she wasn't leaving. The next morning, she woke to find Wyatt already gone and a bundle of firewood stacked neatly by the door, more than she'd need for a week. On the table was a small leather pouch. Inside were 3 silver dollars. Her first wages. Clara held the coins in her palm and felt something crack open in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Earned, not given out of pity or charity or obligation. She'd worked for it, and Wyatt had paid her exactly what he'd promised. She tucked the coins into her carpet bag and got to work. Over the following days, Clara began to notice things about Wyatt that she hadn't seen before. The way he always positioned himself between her and the door, like he was ready to defend her from something she couldn't see. The way he checked the horizon every morning before he left, scanning for threats that never came. The way he kept his rifle within arm's reach, even when he was just sitting at the table drinking coffee. He lived like a man at war, and the enemy was everywhere. One afternoon, while Wyatt was working the herd, Clara decided to tackle the inside of the cabin. She'd cleaned the floors and mended the curtains, but there were still corners she hadn't touched, places where dust had settled for years, thick as snow. She started with the shelves, wiping down jars and tins, reorganizing supplies. Then she moved to the trunk at the foot of Wyatt's bed. She hesitated. It felt like crossing a line, but the trunk was covered in dust, and if she was going to keep this place clean, she needed to clean everything. She lifted the lid. Inside were clothes, neatly folded, shirts, trousers, a heavy winter coat. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small stack of letters tied with string. Clara's fingers hovered over them. She shouldn't. She knew she shouldn't, but she did. The letters were old, the paper yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was careful, feminine. Clara unfolded the first one. My dearest Wyatt, the winter has been hard, but we are managing. The roof held through the last storm, thank the stars. And the chickens are still laying. I miss you terribly. Please come home when you can. All my love. Mother Clara's throat tightened. She read through the others, short letters full of small updates and quiet affection. The garden was doing well. The neighbors had brought by preserves. She was proud of him. She missed him. She loved him. The last letter was different. The handwriting was shakier, the words harder to read. Wyatt, I'm not well. Doc says it's my heart. Don't come rushing back. There's nothing to be done. I just wanted you to know that you were the best thing I ever did in this life. Don't let them make you into something you're not. You're a good man no matter what they say. Be strong, my boy. Mother Clara's vision blurred. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the stack, then closed the trunk and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking. Wyatt's mother had died believing her son was good, and the town had spent years trying to convince him otherwise. When Wyatt came home that evening, Clara had supper waiting, stew, cornbread, and the last jar of preserves from the root cellar. He ate without speaking, but Clara could feel the weight of something unspoken between them. Finally, she set down her spoon and looked at him. I found the letters, she said quietly. Wyatt's hand stilled on his cup. You went through my things. I was cleaning. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have read them. He didn't respond. He just stared into his coffee like he could see the past swirling in the dark liquid. She loved you, Claire said. Your mother. She believed in you. Wyatt's jaw tightened. She was the only one who did. That's not true. He looked up at her, his eyes hard. You don't know what you're talking about. Then tell me. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. For a moment, Clara thought he'd shut her out completely. But then Wyatt set down his cup and leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. 5 years ago, he said slowly, I was working a ranch about 30 miles south of here. Good work, decent pay. I kept to myself, did my job, didn't cause trouble. One night, I was in town getting supplies. A man named Daniel Pritchard came at me in the street, drunk, angry, said I'd been looking at his wife the wrong way. Clara listened, her hands folded in her lap. I told him I didn't know his wife. Told him to go home and sleep it off. But he wouldn't let it go. He threw the first punch. I dodged it. He threw another. I blocked it. Then he pulled a knife. Wyatt's voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reciting facts from a newspaper. I didn't have a choice. I took the knife from him and put him down. He hit his head on the edge of a water trough, split his skull. He was dead before anyone could help him. Clara's breath caught. It was self-defense. That's what I told the sheriff. That's what the witnesses said. But Daniel Pritchard's family was rich, powerful. They didn't care about the truth. They wanted someone to pay. So they blamed you. They did more than that. They spread stories. Said I was violent, dangerous. Said I'd killed him in cold blood over a woman I'd never even met. By the time the trial was over, half the county believed them. But you were acquitted. Barely. And it didn't matter. The damage was done. No one would hire me. No one would talk to me. People crossed the street when they saw me coming. So I came here. Built this cabin. Figured I'd live the life they'd already decided I was living. Alone, away from everyone. Clara's chest ached. That's not fair. Wyatt's laugh was bitter. Fair doesn't mean a damn thing out here. She wanted to argue, to tell him that people could change their minds, that the truth would come out eventually. But she'd seen the way the town looked at him. She'd heard the venom in their voices. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a villain. I'm sorry, Clara said quietly. Wyatt shook his head. Don't be. I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, Clara saw something vulnerable in his eyes, something that hadn't been buried deep enough. Why are you still here, Clara? The question hung in the air between them. Because you gave me a chance when no one else would, she said. And because I don't believe you're the man they say you are. Wyatt held her gaze for a long moment. Then he stood, carried his plate to the wash basin, and walked outside without another word. Clara sat alone at the table, listening to the night settle around the cabin. She didn't regret what she'd said, but she knew that words wouldn't be enough to change what had been done to him. Only time would tell, if anything could. The weeks passed, and the cabin began to feel less like a shelter and more like a home. Clara planted new seeds in the garden, carrots, beans, squash, and tended them carefully. She repaired the chicken coop until it was sturdy enough to hold a small flock, and Wyatt came home one evening with 3 hens tucked under his arm, their feathers ruffled and their eyes suspicious. "Figured we could use the eggs," he said, handing them to Clara like they were made of glass. Clara laughed, a real full laugh that surprised both of them. "I'll take care of them." The hens settled in quickly, and soon there were fresh eggs every morning. Clara used them to make bread that was lighter and richer than anything they'd had before. Wyatt ate 3 slices in one sitting and didn't say a word, but Clara saw the way his shoulders relaxed, the way the hard lines around his mouth softened just a little. She was learning to read him. The small shifts in his posture, the tone of his voice when he was tired versus when he was worried, the way he'd pause in the doorway when he came home, just for a second, like he was checking to make sure she was still there. And she was. Always. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun drop behind the hills, Wyatt spoke without looking at her. "You ever think about leaving?" Clara didn't hesitate. "No." "You could, you know. You've got wages saved now. You could buy a train ticket. Start over somewhere else." "I don't want to start over." Wyatt turned his head, his eyes searching her face. "Why not?" Clara looked out at the valley, at the wild, unforgiving land that had become familiar. "Because I like it here." It was the simplest truth she'd ever spoken, and Wyatt, who had spent years expecting people to leave, didn't know what to do with it. But he didn't argue. He just sat beside her in the fading light, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, someone might stay. The turning point came on a cold morning in early autumn, when the wind carried the smell of rain and the sky was the color of slate. Wyatt had been gone since before dawn, working a fence line on the western edge of his land. Clara was kneading dough for bread when she heard the sound of hooves, fast, urgent. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch. A rider was coming up the trail, his horse lathered and blowing hard. Clara recognized him, one of the ranch hands from the valley, a young man named Tom who'd nodded to her once in town. He pulled up short in front of the cabin, his face pale. "Is Mercer here?" "He's working the west fence. What's wrong?" Tom swallowed hard. "There's trouble in town. The Pritchard boys are saying Wyatt stole cattle from their herd. They're gathering men. They're coming for him." Clara's blood went cold. "That's a lie. Doesn't matter. They've got half the town believing them. If they find him out here alone—" Tom didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Clara's mind raced. "How much time do we have?" "Maybe an hour, maybe less. Go back to town. Tell the sheriff what's happening. Tell him to stop them." "The sheriff won't do anything. He's afraid of the Pritchards." Clara clenched her fists. "Then go anyway. Make noise. Slow them down." Tom hesitated, then nodded and spurred his horse back down the trail. Clara ran to the lean-to, saddled Wyatt's mare, and rode west as fast as the terrain would allow. She found him near the fence line, hammering a post into the rocky ground. He looked up when he heard the horse, his expression shifting to concern when he saw her face. "What happened?" "The Pritchards are coming. They're saying you stole cattle. They're bringing men." Wyatt's jaw tightened. He set down the hammer and walked to his horse, checking the rifle in the saddle scabbard. "Go back to the cabin," he said. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." "No." Wyatt turned to her, his eyes hard. "This isn't your fight, Clara." "Yes, it is." She dismounted and stood in front of him, her chin lifted. "You're not facing them alone. I faced worse. Not with someone watching your back." Wyatt stared at her, and Clara saw the war happening behind his eyes, the instinct to protect her battling against the realization that she wasn't going to back down. "You're stubborn," he said finally. So are you. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Then it was gone. Stay behind me. If things go bad, you ride. You understand? I understand. They rode back to the cabin together. Wyatt loaded his rifle, checked his revolver, and positioned himself on the porch with a clear view of the trail. Clara stood beside him, her heart pounding, her hands steady. They didn't have to wait long. The riders came just before noon, 8 men on horseback, led by 2 broad-shouldered men with the same sharp features and cold eyes. The Pritchard brothers. Behind them were ranch hands and townsmen, all armed, all looking like they'd come for blood. Wyatt stepped to the edge of the porch, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. "That's far enough," he called out. The lead Pritchard, Marcus, the older one, pulled his horse to a stop. "We're here for the cattle you stole, Mercer." "I didn't steal anything." "You calling me a liar?" "I'm calling you wrong." Marcus's face darkened. "We counted our herd. We're missing 15 head. You're the only one out here with land close enough to take them." "Then you counted wrong. Or someone else took them. But it wasn't me." "Prove it." Wyatt's voice was ice. "I don't have to prove a damn thing to you." One of the men behind Marcus shifted in his saddle. "We should just burn him out. Save everyone the trouble." Claire's breath caught, but Wyatt didn't flinch. "You want to try that?" he said quietly. "You better be ready to bury some of your own." The air went still. Marcus's hand drifted toward his gun, and Clara saw Wyatt's finger move to the trigger of his rifle. Then a voice cut through the tension. "Hold on." A man rode forward from the back of the group, older, gray-haired, with a weathered face and steady eyes. Clara recognized him. Sheriff Dalton. "This isn't the way," Dalton said, looking at Marcus. "You've got no proof, just suspicion." "That's enough for me," Marcus growled. "It's not enough for the law." Dalton turned to Wyatt. "You willing to let me search your land?" Wyatt's eyes narrowed. "If it'll end this." Dalton nodded and dismounted. He walked the property slowly, checking the pastures, the lean-to, the cabin. Clara stood on the porch, her hands clenched, watching the Pritchard brothers glare at Wyatt like they were waiting for an excuse. After 20 minutes, Dalton came back shaking his head. "No cattle, no sign of them." Marcus's face twisted. "Then he sold them already." "Or he never had them," Dalton said sharply. "You're wasting my time and yours. Go home." "This isn't over, Mercer," Marcus spat. Wyatt's voice was quiet, lethal. "Yes, it is." The men turned their horses and rode back down the trail, leaving dust and anger in their wake. Sheriff Dalton lingered, his eyes on Wyatt. "You made enemies today," he said. "I've had enemies for years." Dalton sighed. "Watch yourself. The Pritchards don't let things go. Neither do I." The sheriff mounted his horse and rode off, and Clara finally let herself breathe. Wyatt lowered his rifle and turned to her. "You all right?" Clara nodded, even though her hands were shaking. "Are you?" Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and touched her shoulder, just once, just for a second, before turning and walking back into the cabin. It was the first time he'd touched her without a reason, the first time he'd let himself show that he cared. And Clara, standing alone on the porch, realized that somewhere along the way, this had stopped being just a job. It had become something else entirely. That night, they ate in silence. But the silence felt different, heavier, charged with things neither of them knew how to say. When Clara stood to clear the plates, Wyatt spoke. "Thank you." Clara paused. "For what?" "For staying, for not running when you had the chance. I told you, I don't want to leave." Wyatt's eyes met hers, and Clara saw something raw in them, something that looked like hope, fragile and dangerous. "I'm glad," he said quietly. Clara's heart stuttered. She wanted to say more, to tell him that she wasn't just staying out of loyalty or obligation, that somewhere in the last few weeks she'd started to care about him in a way that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with the man he was beneath all the scars and silence. But the words stuck in her throat. So she just nodded and finished cleaning up, and Wyatt sat by the fire, staring into the flames like they held answers he'd been searching for his whole life. Neither of them knew that the worst was still ahead, that the valley was holding its breath, waiting for something none of them could see coming. But for now, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, they had each other. and that was enough. The change came 3 days later, and it didn't announce itself with thunder or lightning. It came with silence. Clara noticed it first. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she realized the birds had stopped singing. The usual chorus of sparrows and jays that filled the morning air was gone, replaced by an emptiness so profound it made her skin prickle. She looked up at the sky. Clear, blue. Nothing out of the ordinary except for that awful, pressing quiet. She walked around to the front of the cabin where Wyatt stood at the edge of the porch, his eyes fixed on the valley below. His posture was rigid, alert, like a wolf catching a scent it didn't recognize. "Something's wrong," he said without looking at her. "What is it?" "I don't know yet." He pointed toward the eastern ridge. "See the deer?" Clara followed his gaze. A small herd of deer was moving across the hillside, but not in their usual meandering pattern. They were climbing, fast and purposeful, heading toward higher ground. "Why are they doing that?" "Because they know something we don't." Wyatt stepped off the porch and walked toward the pasture where his cattle grazed. Clara followed. The cattle were restless, shifting and lowing, their eyes rolling white. One of the older cows had already started moving toward the western slope. Wyatt's jaw tightened. "Get the chickens into the coop. Secure the door." "Wyatt, what's happening?" He turned to her, and the look in his eyes sent ice down her spine. "Storm's coming. A bad one. Maybe worse." Clara had lived through storms before. Rain and wind and thunder that rattled the windows. But the fear in Wyatt's voice told her this was different. She hurried to gather the chickens while Wyatt began moving his small herd of cattle toward the high pasture. The animals resisted at first, then seemed to catch the same instinct that had driven the deer upward. Within an hour, every living creature on Wyatt's land had moved to higher ground except for the two of them. By noon, the sky had changed. The blue had gone gray, then darker, the color of old bruises. The wind picked up, carrying a strange smell, damp earth, ozone, something metallic and wrong. Clara stood on the porch and watched the clouds roll in from the west like a dark tide. Wyatt came up beside her, his rifle slung over his shoulder, a coil of rope in his hand. "We need to go to town," he said. Clara looked at him. "Why?" "Because if I'm reading this right, the valley's about to flood, and Red Hollow's sitting right in the path." "How do you know?" "I've seen it before, not here, but farther north. The ground gets saturated, the creeks overflow, and when the big rain hits, it all comes down at once. The town won't see it coming until it's too late." Clara's heart clenched. "Then we have to warn them." "They won't listen to me." "They have to." Wyatt's expression was grim. "You don't know them like I do. They'd rather drown than take my word for anything." "Then we make them listen." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Get your coat. We leave now." They saddled both horses and rode hard toward Red Hollow. The wind howled around them, tearing at their clothes, carrying the first cold drops of rain. The sky was a roiling mass of black and gray, and the air felt heavy, oppressive, like the world was holding its breath before a scream. They reached the edge of town just as the rain began in earnest. Fat, heavy drops that hit the ground like bullets. Wyatt pulled his horse to a stop in the middle of the main street and dismounted. Clara did the same. The street was busy, people hurrying between buildings, carrying supplies, laughing at the sudden downpour like it was nothing more than an inconvenience. Wyatt strode toward the sheriff's office, his boots splashing through the rapidly forming puddles. Clara stayed close behind him. Sheriff Dalton looked up from his desk when they burst through the door, rain dripping from their coats. "Mercer, what are you doing here?" "There's a flood coming. You need to evacuate the town." Dalton frowned. "It's just rain." "It's not just rain. The ground's already saturated from the storms last week. The creeks are swollen. When this hits full force, the whole valley is going to come down like a hammer. You've got maybe 2 hours. Dalton stood slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You expect me to evacuate the entire town based on your say-so? I expect you to do your job and protect these people. I don't see any flood." "You will. By then it'll be too late." Dalton's face hardened. "I'm not causing a panic over a hunch. If you're wrong, I'll have a riot on my hands. And if I'm right, you'll have corpses." The two men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to choke on. Clara stepped forward. Sheriff, please. Wyatt knows this land. If he says there's danger, you need to listen. Dalton's eyes flicked to her, then back to Wyatt. I've got no reason to trust him, and neither do you, Miss Voss. I've got every reason to trust him, Clara said quietly. He's never lied to me, not once. Dalton's expression didn't change. Get out of my office. Wyatt's fists clenched, but he turned and walked out without another word. Clara followed, her chest tight with frustration and fear. Outside, the rain was coming harder now, a steady downpour that turned the street into a river of mud. People were starting to retreat indoors, shutters closing, lamps being lit. Wyatt stood in the middle of the street, looking around like he was calculating odds. What do we do? Clara asked. We try the others. They went door to door. The general store, the saloon, the church, the boarding house. Every time the response was the same. Suspicion, dismissal, outright hostility. The shopkeeper slammed the door in Wyatt's face. The saloon owner told him to get the hell out before he threw him out. The preacher listened for 30 seconds, then shook his head and said he had faith that the town would be fine. With every rejection, Clara felt her desperation grow. These people were going to die because they hated Wyatt more than they feared the storm. They were standing in front of the church, rain pouring down, when the ground shook. It was subtle at first, a tremor that Clara felt in her bones more than heard. Then it came again, stronger, and the bell in the church tower swung once, sending a single mournful note into the storm. Wyatt's head snapped toward the western hills. It's starting. Clara followed his gaze and saw it. A wall of water, dark and churning, roaring down the valley like a living thing. It was still a mile away, maybe less, but it was moving fast, devouring everything in its path. Trees snapped like kindling. Boulders tumbled like pebbles. The sound was deafening, a low roar that made Clara's chest vibrate. Get to high ground, Wyatt bellowed, his voice cutting through the storm. Flood's coming! Everyone to high ground! People stopped, turned, saw the wall of water bearing down on them. For a split second, the world went still. Then chaos erupted. People screamed, doors flew open, families poured into the street, children crying, parents shouting. Wyatt grabbed Clara's arm. Get to the church. It's the highest point in town. What about you? I'm getting as many people out as I can. Go! Clara wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes told her there was no time. She ran toward the church, fighting against the surge of panicked townspeople. Behind her, she could hear Wyatt shouting, directing people, his voice a beacon in the madness. The water hit the edge of town with a sound like a cannon blast. The first buildings crumpled under the force. The old livery stable, the abandoned warehouse, a row of shacks on the western edge. The flood surged forward, black and merciless, carrying debris and destruction. Clara reached the church and threw open the door. Inside, people were already gathering, their faces pale with terror. The preacher stood at the front, trying to maintain order, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the water and the screams outside. Clara turned back to the doorway. Through the rain and chaos, she saw Wyatt. He was in the middle of the street, pulling people from collapsing porches, dragging children out of the mud, shouting directions. A woman stumbled and fell, and Wyatt hauled her to her feet and shoved her toward the church. A man was trapped under a fallen beam, and Wyatt lifted it with raw strength, freeing him. The water was rising. It had reached the main street now, swirling around Wyatt's knees, then his waist. He didn't stop. He kept moving, kept fighting, kept pulling people from the jaws of death. Clara saw a child, a little girl, maybe 6 years old, clinging to the porch railing of a house that was already half submerged. The girl was screaming, her voice thin and terrified. Wyatt saw her too. He turned and waded toward the house, the current fighting him with every step. The porch gave a sickening lurch, the railing snapped. The girl fell into the water. Wyatt dove. Clara's heart stopped. The water was too fast, too strong. She couldn't see him, couldn't see the girl. There was only the roiling black surface and the debris crashing past. Then Wyatt surfaced, the girl clutched to his chest. He fought his way to the side of a building, using the wall for leverage, and hauled himself and the child onto a balcony. He handed the girl to a man who was leaning out of a second-story window, then turned and dove back into the water. Over and over, he went in. Over and over, he came back. He pulled a woman from a window, dragged an old man from a collapsing roof, Saved a boy who'd been swept off his feet and was clinging to a fence post. His hands were bleeding, his face was cut, his clothes were torn. But he didn't stop. Clara couldn't just stand there. She turned to the people in the church. "We need rope, blankets, anything we can use to pull people in." For a moment, no one moved. Then a woman, the same seamstress who'd turned Clara away weeks ago, stepped forward with a coil of rope. A man brought blankets, another brought a ladder. Together they worked. They threw ropes to people trapped on rooftops. They guided survivors to the church. They created a human chain to pull the injured to safety. And at the center of it all was Wyatt, still in the water, still fighting, still refusing to give up. The flood raged for 2 hours. 2 hours of hell and horror, and the kind of fear that burns itself into your bones. When the water finally began to recede, Red Hollow was unrecognizable. Buildings were destroyed. Streets were buried under mud and debris. The western half of town was simply gone, swept away like it had never existed. But the people were alive. Most of them. Not all. There would be bodies found in the days to come, casualties of the speed and ferocity of the flood. But far more had survived than should have, and they all knew why. Wyatt Mercer had saved them. He stood in the middle of what was left of the main street, chest heaving, blood and mud streaked across his face. His hands hung at his sides, torn and raw, and Clara could see the exhaustion in every line of his body. But he was still standing. Clara ran to him. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She just threw her arms around him and held on tight. Wyatt stiffened, then slowly, carefully, his arms came up around her. He didn't say anything. He just held her, and Clara felt the tremor in his hands, the weight of everything he'd just endured. "You did it," she whispered. "You saved them." Wyatt's voice was hoarse, broken. "Not all of them. You saved as many as you could. That's what matters." People were starting to gather, the same people who'd turned Wyatt away, who'd cursed his name, who'd called him a killer. They stood in the mud and the rain and stared at him, and Clara saw something shift in their faces. Shame, gratitude, understanding. Sheriff Dalton was the first to step forward. His face was drawn, his eyes red. He stopped in front of Wyatt and took off his hat. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I should have listened to you. I'm sorry." Wyatt didn't respond. He just nodded once, and Dalton stepped aside. The shopkeeper came next, then the saloon owner, then the preacher. One by one, they approached Wyatt, and one by one, they offered their thanks. Some shook his hand, some just nodded. A few had tears in their eyes. The woman whose daughter Wyatt had pulled from the flood pushed through the crowd. She was trembling, her face pale, but her eyes were fierce. She walked up to Wyatt and took his bloody hand in both of hers. "You saved my baby," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you. Thank you." Wyatt's jaw tightened. He looked down at the woman, and Clara saw something crack in his expression, something he'd been holding back for years. "She's safe," he said quietly. "That's all that matters." The woman sobbed and pressed her forehead to his hand, and Clara felt her own eyes burn. Marcus Pritchard was there too, standing at the edge of the crowd. His face was hard, unreadable, but his younger brother stood beside him with a bandage wrapped around his head and gratitude in his eyes. Marcus met Wyatt's gaze across the muddy street, and for a long moment neither man moved. Then Marcus nodded once. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. And that was something. By nightfall, the survivors had gathered in the church. The pews were packed with exhausted, traumatized people wrapped in blankets, drinking hot coffee, trying to process what had happened. Clara moved among them, offering comfort where she could, checking injuries, helping reunite families. Wyatt sat on the steps outside, his head in his hands. Clara found him there and sat down beside him. She didn't say anything. She just sat with him in the silence, and after a while Wyatt spoke. "I've spent 5 years convincing myself I didn't need anyone, that I was better off alone." Clara waited. "But tonight, I needed them, and they needed me, and I don't know what to do with that." Clara reached over and took his hand. His fingers were torn, crusted with dried blood, but she held on anyway. "You don't have to figure it out tonight," she said. "You just have to rest." Wyatt looked at her, and in his eyes, Clara saw exhaustion and relief and something deeper, something that looked like the beginning of hope. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said quietly. "Yes, you could have. You were already doing it when I found you. But you stayed. You stood with me when no one else would." Clara's throat tightened. "Because I believe in you, Wyatt. I always have." He held her gaze, and Clara saw the walls he'd built around himself begin to crumble. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. "I need to go home," he said finally. "I need to check the cabin, the animals. Can you even stay in the saddle?" "I have to." Clara stood and pulled him to his feet. "Then I'm coming with you." "Clara, don't argue. You're hurt. You're exhausted. You're not riding alone." Wyatt looked like he wanted to protest, but the fight had gone out of him. He just nodded, and together they walked to where their horses were tied. The ride back to the cabin was slow and painful. Wyatt swayed in the saddle more than once, and Clara stayed close, ready to catch him if he fell. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky full of stars and a land scarred by water and violence. The trails were washed out in places, forcing them to take detours, but eventually the cabin came into view. It was still standing, battered, but standing. The garden was destroyed, the chicken coop half collapsed, but the structure itself had held. Wyatt dismounted with a grimace and stumbled toward the porch. Clara caught his arm and steadied him. "Inside, now." She got him through the door and into a chair. Then she lit the lamps, built up the fire, and filled a basin with warm water. Wyatt sat silent and still as she cleaned his wounds, her hands gentle but thorough. The cuts on his hands were deep, some down to the bone. His arms were bruised and swollen. There was a gash on his forehead that needed stitching. Clara worked carefully, stitching and bandaging, her heart aching with every wince he couldn't quite hide. When she was finished, she made him drink water, then coffee, then finally convinced him to lie down. Wyatt stretched out on his bed, fully clothed, and closed his eyes. Clara pulled a blanket over him and started to step back, but his hand caught hers. "Stay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara's breath caught. "I'm not going anywhere." "No, I mean stay here. Don't go to the cot." He wasn't asking for anything improper. He was just asking not to be alone. Clara understood. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her hand still in his, and Wyatt's grip tightened just slightly. "I thought I was going to die out there," he said quietly, "more than once, and all I could think was that I didn't want to leave you alone." Clara's eyes burned. "You didn't. You came back." "Because I had something to come back to." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "I had you." Clara's heart cracked open. She leaned down and pressed her forehead to his, their hands clasped between them. "You'll always have me," she whispered. "I promise." Wyatt's eyes closed again, and his breathing deepened. Within minutes, he was asleep, his hand still holding hers. Clara stayed there until dawn, watching over him, and when the sun finally rose over the valley, she saw the world transformed. The flood had scarred the land, yes, but it had also washed away the lies, the hatred, the walls that had kept Wyatt isolated for so long. He had saved the town, and in doing so, he had saved himself. Clara woke to the smell of smoke and coffee, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then she felt the stiffness in her neck, the ache in her back from sitting upright all night in the chair she'd pulled beside Wyatt's bed. Dawn light filtered through the cabin windows, pale and cold, illuminating the destruction visible through the glass. Broken branches, mud-slicked earth, the chicken coop listing dangerously to one side. Wyatt was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with his bandaged hands resting on his knees. He'd managed to get the fire going despite his injuries, and the coffee pot sat steaming on the grate. He looked worse in the daylight. Bruises blooming purple and yellow across his arms, the gash on his forehead angry and swollen, his face haggard with exhaustion that sleep hadn't been able to touch. "You should have woken me," Clara said, standing and wincing as her spine protested. "I would have made the coffee." "You were asleep. Figured you'd earned it." His voice was rough, scraped raw from shouting through the storm. Clara moved to the hearth and poured 2 cups, then brought one to him. Their fingers brushed as he took it, and she saw him wince at the contact. The cuts on his palms had bled through the bandages during the night. "Let me change those," she said. Later. We need to assess the damage first. Wyatt. I'm fine, Clara. He wasn't fine. She could see it in the way he held himself, in the careful precision of his movements, in the tight line of his mouth that meant he was in more pain than he'd admit. But she also knew that arguing with him when he'd made up his mind was like trying to stop the rain with your bare hands. All right, she said quietly. But after we check the property, you're letting me tend those wounds properly. Wyatt nodded and stood, moving toward the door with the measured gait of a man whose body was threatening to betray him at any moment. Clara grabbed her coat and followed him outside. The valley looked like a battlefield. The flood had carved new channels through the earth, leaving behind scars of exposed rock and uprooted trees. Wyatt's small herd of cattle had survived by staying on the high pasture, but the garden was completely destroyed, every carefully tended plant torn from the ground or buried under mud. The chicken coop had lost half its roof, and 2 of the 3 hens were missing. The lean-to where they kept the horses had held, but the fence around the pasture was gone, rails scattered like matchsticks across the hillside. Wyatt surveyed it all in silence, his jaw tight. Clara stood beside him and felt the weight of what had been lost pressing down on both of them. This wasn't just property damage. This was months of work undone in a single night. The garden that had just started producing, the repairs she'd made with her own bleeding hands, the small sense of order and home they'd built together, all of it ravaged. We'll rebuild, Clara said, more to herself than to him. Wyatt turned to look at her. This is going to take weeks, maybe months. Then it takes months. Clara, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. She met his eyes. Unless you're trying to get rid of me. Something softened in his expression. No, I'm not. Then stop arguing and let me help you. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. There and gone so fast, Clara almost missed it. Then he turned back to survey the damage, and they began the long work of salvaging what they could. They spent the morning gathering scattered tools, pulling debris from the remains of the garden, and trying to coax the surviving hen back into what was left of the coop. Wyatt moved slowly, his injuries making every task twice as difficult, but he refused to stop. Clara worked alongside him, her own body aching from the previous night's chaos, her hands raw from handling rough wood and stone. By noon, they'd managed to clear a small area near the cabin and salvage enough boards to patch the worst holes in the lean-to. Clara was hammering a nail into place when she heard the sound of horses coming up the trail. Her first thought was the Pritchards, come to cause more trouble. But when she looked up, she saw Sheriff Dalton riding at the head of a group of townspeople, 8 men and 3 women, all carrying tools and supplies. Wyatt straightened, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle leaning against the porch rail. Clara stepped beside him. Dalton dismounted and approached slowly, his hat in his hands. The others stayed back, watching. "Mercer," Dalton said, "we came to help." Wyatt's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because you helped us. Seemed only right to return the favor." "I don't need charity." "It's not charity. It's what neighbors do." Dalton gestured to the people behind him. "We figured you'd have damage up here, same as everyone else. Thought we could make faster work of it together." Wyatt looked at Clara, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. Years of mistrust warring against the fragile hope that maybe things had changed. She gave him a small nod. "All right," Wyatt said finally, "but I'm not taking handouts. You work, I'll feed you. That's the deal." Dalton smiled. "Fair enough." The group dispersed across the property, and within an hour the place was transformed by the presence of so many hands. The men rebuilt the fence, patched the chicken coop, and cleared the worst of the debris. The women helped Clara salvage what could be saved from the garden and started preparing food in the cabin. It was strange seeing the small space filled with people, hearing voices and laughter where there had been only silence for so long. Clara found herself working alongside the seamstress who'd turned her away that first day in Red Hollow. The woman's name was Ruth, and she worked with quick, efficient movements, her face serious. "I owe you an apology," Ruth said after a while, not looking up from the carrots she was peeling. Clara glanced at her. "For what?" "For being cruel when you needed help. For believing the worst about Wyatt without questioning it. For being a coward." Ruth set down the knife and met Clara's eyes. "You were braver than any of us. You saw who he really was when the rest of us were too busy being afraid. Clara's throat tightened. I didn't do anything special. I just listened. That's more than we did. Ruth picked up the knife again. He saved my nephew yesterday, pulled him off a roof when the water was already over his head. I'll never forget that. And I'll never forgive myself for how we treated him. Then make it right now, Clara said quietly. That's all you can do. Ruth nodded, and they worked in silence for a while, the understanding between them more solid than words. By late afternoon, the property looked almost livable again. The fence was rebuilt, the coop was secure, and the debris had been cleared into neat piles for burning. The men gathered on the porch, drinking coffee and talking in low voices, while the women finished preparing a meal large enough to feed everyone. Clara watched Wyatt move among them, stiff and uncomfortable, but trying. He answered questions about the flood, explained how he'd read the signs, demonstrated how to identify dangerous water levels. The men listened with respect, and Clara saw something shift in Wyatt's posture. He was still guarded, still careful, but he wasn't as closed off as he'd been. When the meal was ready, they all sat together, some on the porch, some on the ground, some leaning against the fence. It was the first time Wyatt's cabin had seen a gathering like this, probably the first time in years. Clara served food and watched the way people interacted with Wyatt now, not with fear or suspicion, but with something closer to respect, maybe even gratitude. Sheriff Dalton raised his cup. To Wyatt Mercer, the man who saved Red Hollow. To Wyatt, the others echoed. Wyatt's face flushed, and he looked down at his plate. Clara saw his hands tighten on his fork, saw the way his shoulders tensed. This kind of attention made him deeply uncomfortable. But he nodded once in acknowledgement, and that seemed to be enough. As the sun began to set, the townspeople packed up their tools and prepared to leave. One by one, they came to say goodbye to Wyatt. Some shook his hand carefully, mindful of his injuries. Some clapped him on the shoulder. A few of the women hugged Clara and thanked her for her hospitality. Ruth lingered after the others had mounted their horses. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small package wrapped in cloth. For you, she said, handing it to Clara. I know the flood destroyed your garden. These are seeds. My best stock. Should get you through to next spring. Clara's eyes burned. Thank you. Thank you, Ruth said, for reminding us what decent people look like. She left before Clara could respond, and Clara stood on the porch holding the package of seeds, feeling like something fundamental had shifted in the world. When the last rider disappeared down the trail, Wyatt sank into the chair on the porch with a heavy exhale. Clara sat beside him, the package of seeds still in her hands. How do you feel? She asked. Like I got kicked by a horse, several horses. I meant about them. The town. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Strange. I spent 5 years being invisible to them. Now they can't stop looking at me. They see you differently now. They see what I did, not who I am. Clara turned to face him. What you did is who you are, Wyatt. You risked your life for people who hated you. That says everything about your character. Or it says I'm an idiot. It says you're a good man. Wyatt looked at her, and Clara saw something raw and vulnerable in his eyes. I don't know how to be what they want me to be. They don't want you to be anything except yourself. The man who warned them, who saved them, who's been surviving out here with nothing but his own strength and stubbornness. She reached over and took his bandaged hand gently. That's enough, Wyatt. You're enough. His fingers tightened around hers, and for a long moment they sat in silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. The valley was scarred, yes, but it was still beautiful, still alive, still holding on. I need to change your bandages, Clara said finally. Wyatt nodded and followed her inside. She sat him at the table and carefully unwrapped the cloth from his hands. The cuts were deep and angry, some showing signs of infection despite her care. She cleaned them with whiskey, applied fresh salve, and wrapped them in clean bandages. Wyatt sat motionless through it all, his jaw tight. You need to rest these, Clara said. No heavy work for at least a week. Can't afford to rest, too much to do. Then I'll do it. Clara. Don't argue with me. You can barely hold a fork. How are you going to hold a hammer? Wyatt's mouth twitched. You're stubborn. I learned from the best. He looked at her for a long moment, and Clara saw affection flicker in his eyes. Real, undeniable affection. It made her heart stutter. "All right," he said quietly, "but only for a few days. A week. 5 days. 6, and that's final." Wyatt smiled, an actual smile, small but genuine. "Deal." Over the following days, Clara ran the property while Wyatt's hands healed. She fed the animals, repaired the remaining damage to the coop, and started clearing the garden for replanting. Wyatt tried to help despite his injuries, and Clara had to physically stop him more than once, putting herself between him and whatever task he was attempting. "You're worse than the cattle," she said one morning after catching him trying to lift a heavy beam one-handed. "The cattle listen better than you do." "The cattle have more sense than you do." Wyatt set down the beam and looked at her with exasperation that was undercut by amusement. "You're enjoying this?" "Watching you follow orders for once? Absolutely." He shook his head, but there was warmth in his expression that hadn't been there before. The walls between them were coming down, brick by brick, and neither of them seemed inclined to rebuild them. On the 4th day, a rider came up the trail. Clara was hanging laundry when she saw him, a well-dressed man on a fine horse, moving with the kind of careful authority that spoke of money and position. She called for Wyatt, and he emerged from the cabin, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the visitor. Marcus Pritchard. The older Pritchard brother dismounted slowly, his expression unreadable. He stood at the base of the porch steps, his hat in his hands, and looked up at Wyatt. "I came to talk," Marcus said. "So talk." Marcus glanced at Clara, then back at Wyatt. "Alone, if you don't mind." "Anything you have to say, you can say in front of her." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Fair enough." He took a breath. "My younger brother, the one you pulled from the flood. He's my only family left. Our parents are gone. Our sister died 2 years back. He's all I've got." Wyatt waited, his expression giving nothing away. "When the water hit, I thought I'd lost him. I saw the building collapse, saw the water take him under, and I thought that was it." Marcus's voice was rough, strained. "But you went in after him. You pulled him out when you didn't have to. When you could have let him drown after everything we've done to you." "I don't let people drown," Wyatt said quietly. "I know that now. And I need you to know something." Marcus met Wyatt's eyes. "I was wrong. About Daniel Pritchard. About what happened 5 years ago." The air went still. Clara felt her breath catch. "Daniel was my cousin," Marcus continued, "and he was drunk. Violent. Always had been. The family knew it, but we covered for him because that's what we did. When he came at you that night, I knew he'd started it, but it was easier to blame you than to admit what he really was." Wyatt's expression didn't change, but Clara saw his hands clench. "I helped spread the lies," Marcus said. "I helped destroy your reputation because I was angry and grieving and looking for someone to punish. And I'm sorry. I can't undo what I did, but I can tell you the truth now. You defended yourself. Daniel attacked you, and you had every right to protect yourself." The silence stretched between them. Clara wanted to say something, to break the tension, but this moment belonged to Wyatt and Marcus alone. "Why now?" Wyatt asked finally. "Because you saved my brother. Because I owe you the truth. And because I'm tired of living with the lie." Marcus paused. "I'm going to tell the whole town. Set the record straight. It won't fix everything, but it's a start." Wyatt studied Marcus for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "All right." Marcus looked surprised, like he'd expected anger or demands or conditions. "That's it?" "That's it. You tell the truth. That's all I ever wanted." Marcus's shoulders sagged with relief. He put his hat back on and turned toward his horse, then paused. "For what it's worth, Mercer, you're a better man than I am." "I just know what it's like to lose everything," Wyatt said. "I wouldn't wish that on anyone, not even you." Marcus nodded, mounted his horse, and rode away. Clara and Wyatt stood on the porch and watched until he disappeared from view. "Did that just happen?" Clara asked quietly. "I think it did." "How do you feel?" Wyatt was silent for a long moment. "Like maybe I can stop fighting ghosts." Clara reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. They stood together in the afternoon light, and Clara felt the weight of the past 5 years begin to lift from Wyatt's shoulders. That evening, they sat on the porch and watched the stars emerge one by one. Wyatt's hands were healing. The bandages smaller now, the worst of the infection beaten back. The cabin was quiet, the valley peaceful, and for the first time since Clara had arrived, the silence didn't feel heavy with things unsaid. "I've been thinking," Wyatt said. Clara looked at him. "About what?" "About the future. About what comes next." "And?" He turned to face her fully. "I want you to stay, not as hired help, not as someone who works for me, but as—" He hesitated, searching for words. "As someone who belongs here. With me." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Wyatt, I know I'm not easy. I know I've got a past that's going to follow me no matter what Marcus says to the town. I know I can't offer you much except hard work and a cabin in the middle of nowhere. But I can offer you honesty. And I can tell you that I care about you, more than I thought I could care about anyone." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. "I care about you too." "Then stay. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you want to be here." "I do want to be here," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I want to be with you." Wyatt reached up and cupped her face in his bandaged hands, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Then we'll figure the rest out together." Clara leaned into his touch, and when Wyatt pulled her close, she went willingly, burying her face in his shoulder and letting herself feel the full weight of everything they'd survived to get to this moment. The betrayal, the desperation, the flood, the fear. All of it had led them here, to this porch, to this man, to this choice. And Clara chose him. Freely. Completely. When she pulled back, Wyatt was looking at her with an expression so tender it made her chest ache. "I love you," he said quietly. "I don't know when it happened. Maybe that first night when you stood up to me in the saloon, maybe when you defended me in town, maybe when you stayed by my side through the flood. But it happened. And I needed you to know." Clara's breath caught. "I love you too." The words hung between them, simple and true and more powerful than any vow. Wyatt leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, and they stayed like that as the stars wheeled overhead and the night wrapped around them like a blanket. The next morning, they woke to the sound of more riders approaching. Clara looked out the window and saw what seemed like half of Red Hollow making its way up the trail, wagons loaded with lumber, tools, seeds, and supplies. At the front rode Sheriff Dalton and the preacher, and behind them came families, tradesmen, ranchers, people Clara recognized and people she'd never seen before. Wyatt stepped onto the porch, and Clara joined him. Dalton dismounted and approached with a broad smile. "Morning, Mercer, Miss Voss." "Sheriff," Wyatt said warily. "What's all this?" "This," Dalton said, gesturing to the crowd, "is a barn raising, or in this case, a property restoration. We figured you'd need help getting this place back in order, and the town decided to make a day of it." "I can't afford to pay all these people." "Nobody's asking for pay. This is a thank you. From all of us." Clara saw Wyatt struggle with the gesture, saw the way he wanted to refuse but couldn't quite find the words. She stepped forward and took his hand. "We'd be honored," she said. The crowd dispersed across the property with the organized chaos of people who knew what they were doing. The men started rebuilding the garden beds and reinforcing the structures that had been damaged. The women set up tables and began preparing food. Children ran between the work sites, carrying tools and messages, their laughter bright and clear. Clara worked alongside Ruth and several other women, and they talked while they cooked, about the flood, about rebuilding, about the future. More than once, someone mentioned how lucky Wyatt was to have found Clara, and how lucky Clara was to have found Wyatt. She didn't disagree. By midday, the garden beds were rebuilt and ready for planting. The chicken coop had been completely reconstructed, better than before. The fence was solid and straight, and someone had even built a small addition onto the lean-to, giving them more storage space. When the work was done, they all gathered for a meal, massive and communal and loud with conversation. Wyatt sat at the center of it, still uncomfortable with the attention but trying. Clara watched him answer questions, accept compliments with awkward grace, and slowly, incrementally, let himself be part of something larger than his own solitude. As the sun began to set and people started packing up to leave, the preacher approached Wyatt and Clara. "I've been authorized by the town council to make you an offer," he said. Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "What kind of offer?" "We'd like to hire you as a consultant. Teach us how to read the land the way you do, how to prepare for disasters, how to survive out here." The preacher smiled. "Turns out we don't know nearly as much as we thought we did, and you've proven you do." Wyatt looked stunned. "You want to pay me to teach you?" "We do. Fair wage, flexible hours. What do you say?" Wyatt glanced at Clara, and she gave him an encouraging nod. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all we ask." The preacher tipped his hat and walked away. When the last wagon had rolled down the trail and the property was quiet again, Wyatt and Clara stood on the porch and looked at what the town had built. "They care about you," Clara said. "They feel guilty." "Maybe, but guilt doesn't make people show up like that. Respect does." She turned to him. "You've earned their respect, Wyatt. Maybe it's time you let yourself accept it." Wyatt was quiet for a long time. Then he pulled Clara close and held her, and she felt the last of the tension drain from his body. "I never thought I'd have this," he said quietly. "A home. People who didn't hate me. You. You have all of it now. And I'm not letting it go." Clara smiled against his chest. "Good. Because neither am I." The weeks that followed felt like living in a different world entirely, one where the rules Clara and Wyatt had learned to survive by no longer applied. The garden they replanted together grew faster than it should have, fed by rich soil the flood had deposited and tended by two pairs of hands that had learned to work in quiet synchrony. The chickens multiplied. Ruth brought over a rooster and two more hens, and soon the coop was alive with the sound of clucking and the promise of fresh eggs every morning. The cabin itself seemed to breathe easier, as if the weight of loneliness that had pressed down on its walls for years had finally lifted. Wyatt accepted the town's offer to teach survival skills, though he set his own terms. He'd meet with small groups twice a week, never more than 6 people at a time, and always on his land where he felt steady ground beneath his feet. The first session was awkward. Wyatt spoke in clipped sentences, his explanations efficient but stripped of any warmth. But the people listened. They learned how to read cloud formations, how to identify dangerous water levels in the creeks, how to preserve food for harsh winters, how to track animals through different terrains. Clara attended every session, not because she needed to learn, though she did, but because she saw what it cost Wyatt to open himself to scrutiny like this. After each lesson, when the people had left and the valley fell quiet again, she'd find him on the porch staring at the horizon, processing the strange reality that he was no longer the most hated man in Red Hollow, but something closer to respected. "You're a good teacher," she told him one evening after a particularly successful session where he'd taught 3 ranchers how to predict early frost. Wyatt shook his head. "I just tell them what I know. That's what teaching is. Feels like more than that. Feels like they're trusting me." "They are." Clara sat beside him and took his hand, now healed except for the pale scars that would mark his palms forever. "And you're proving every day that their trust isn't misplaced." Wyatt turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the dying light. "I keep waiting for it to fall apart, for them to remember who I was and decide they made a mistake." "Who you were is who you are now, Wyatt. You didn't change. They just finally saw clearly." He pulled her close, and Clara rested her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of pine and leather and the particular warmth that belonged only to him. These moments of stillness had become her favorite part of the day, when the work was done and they could simply exist together without the weight of the world pressing down on them. But the world wasn't finished with them yet. 3 weeks after the flood, Sheriff Dalton rode up to the cabin with a letter in his hand and an expression Clara couldn't quite read. She was in the garden pulling weeds when he arrived, and she called for Wyatt, who emerged from the lean-to covered in sawdust from building new shelves. "Sheriff," Wyatt said, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Something wrong?" Dalton dismounted and held out the letter. "This came for you, from the territorial governor's office." Wyatt's face went carefully blank. He took the letter, broke the seal, and read in silence, while Clara and Dalton waited. When he looked up, his expression was stunned. "What is it?" Clara asked. It's a commendation for heroism during the flood. Wyatt's voice was distant, disbelieving. They want to present it publicly, in front of the whole town. Dalton smiled. Marcus Pritchard wrote to them, told them what you did. Several other people did too. The governor wants to acknowledge it officially. I don't need acknowledgement. Maybe not, but the town does. They need to see this made right. Dalton's expression turned serious. They're also reopening the investigation into Daniel Pritchard's death. Marcus gave a formal statement about what really happened that night. With his testimony and the original witness accounts, they're planning to issue an official exoneration. The word hung in the air like a bell. Exoneration. Not just the town's forgiveness, but the law's recognition that Wyatt had been innocent all along. Clara saw Wyatt's throat work as he swallowed. When? 2 weeks. They'll do both ceremonies on the same day. Dalton paused. There's one more thing. The territorial judge wants to offer you a position, deputy marshal for this region. Part-time, but official. Seems they figure a man who can predict floods and save towns might be useful for keeping the peace, too. Wyatt looked like he'd been struck by lightning. They want me to be a lawman? They want you to be who you've already proven you are. Someone who protects people, even when it's hard. Even when they don't deserve it. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She reached for Wyatt's hand and squeezed it hard. What do you think? Dalton asked. Wyatt looked at Clara, and she saw the question in his eyes. This was more than a job offer. This was a complete transformation of his life. From outcast to authority, from suspect to protector. It was everything he'd never dared to want. What do you think? He asked her quietly. Clara didn't hesitate. I think you'd be extraordinary at it. It would mean traveling sometimes, being away from the cabin. I'll be here when you come back, always. Wyatt held her gaze for a long moment, then turned to Dalton. Tell them yes. Dalton's grin was wide enough to split his face. I was hoping you'd say that. He mounted his horse and tipped his hat. See you at the ceremony, Deputy Mercer. After Dalton left, Wyatt stood in the yard holding the letter like it might dissolve if he let go. Clara wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressing her cheek against his back. How are you feeling? She asked. Like I'm dreaming, like I'm going to wake up and none of this will be real. It's real, Wyatt. You earned every bit of it. He turned in her embrace and cupped her face in his scarred hands. I couldn't have done any of it without you. You know that, right? We did it together. No. His voice was fierce. You saved me first. That night in the saloon when you refused to walk away, when you stood up to the whole town, when you stayed even after you knew the truth. You saved me long before I saved anyone else. Clara's vision blurred with tears. Then we saved each other. Wyatt kissed her then, slow and deep, and full of everything words couldn't hold. When they finally pulled apart, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Clara mended Wyatt's best clothes and made herself a new dress from fabric Ruth brought as a gift. The town buzzed with excitement about the ceremony, and people Clara barely knew stopped her in the street to tell her how proud they were, how much Wyatt deserved this recognition, how lucky the valley was to have him. The night before the ceremony, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay on the cot. She'd insisted on keeping it even though Wyatt had offered her his bed a dozen times, and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Tomorrow would change everything. Tomorrow, Wyatt would step into a new life, one where the shadow of Daniel Pritchard's death no longer followed him. One where he was recognized not for what people had falsely believed he'd done, but for what he'd actually accomplished. She heard movement across the room and turned to see Wyatt sitting on the edge of his bed, his silhouette dark against the dying firelight. Can't sleep either? She asked quietly. No. Clara got up and crossed the room, sitting beside him. What are you thinking about? About my mother. Wishing she could see this. She believed in me when no one else did, and she died thinking I'd spend the rest of my life as an outcast. Clara took his hand. She knew who you were, Wyatt. That was enough for her, and I think she'd be proud of the man you've become. I hope so. He was quiet for a moment. I keep thinking about that first night, when you stopped me in the saloon and asked for help. If I'd walked past you, if I hadn't listened, none of this would have happened." "But you did listen. That says everything about who you are." Wyatt turned to her, his eyes catching the firelight. "Marry me." Clara's breath stopped. "What?" "Marry me, Clara. Not because you need protection or a roof over your head. Not because I need someone to keep the house. But because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Because you make me better. Because I can't imagine a future that doesn't have you in it." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. "Wyatt, you don't have to answer now. I know it's sudden. I know." "Yes." He stopped mid-sentence. "Yes? Yes, I'll marry you." Clara laughed through the tears streaming down her face. "Of course I'll marry you." Wyatt pulled her into his arms so fast they nearly toppled backward. He buried his face in her hair, and Clara felt his shoulders shake with emotion too big for words. They held each other in the darkness, and Clara thought about the long, impossible road that had brought them here. The betrayal that had left her stranded, the hatred that had isolated him, the flood that had nearly destroyed them both. All of it had been terrible and brutal and unfair, and all of it had led to this moment. "When?" Wyatt asked, his voice rough. "Whenever you want." "Tomorrow. After the ceremony. In front of everyone." Clara pulled back to look at him. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I want everyone to know you're mine and I'm yours. I want it official and public and permanent." Clara kissed him, pouring everything she felt into it, love and gratitude and wonder that they'd found each other in the wreckage. When they finally broke apart, Wyatt was smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile that transformed his whole face. "We should probably tell the preacher," Clara said, "first thing in the morning." They sat together on the edge of the bed until the fire burned down to embers, planning a future neither of them had dared to imagine just a few months ago. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect autumn day that made the valley look like something out of a painting. Clara dressed carefully in her new dress, simple but elegant, the color of sage, and braided her hair with wild flowers Ruth had brought at sunrise, along with tears and congratulations. Wyatt stood in front of the mirror in his clean shirt and vest, fumbling with his collar until Clara gently pushed his hands aside and fixed it herself. "You look handsome," she said. "I look uncomfortable." "That too." She smiled and kissed his cheek. "But handsome first." They rode into town together, and Clara's breath caught when she saw what waited for them. The entire population of Red Hollow had turned out, hundreds of people lining the streets, gathered in front of the church, filling every available space. Someone had built a platform in the town square, decorated with bunting and flowers. A band was playing. Children ran between the adults, laughing and waving small flags. Sheriff Dalton met them at the edge of town and escorted them through the crowd to the platform. Clara saw faces she recognized. Ruth, the shopkeeper, the saloon owner, the families Wyatt had saved from the flood. But there were also faces she'd never seen, people from neighboring towns who'd heard about the ceremony and come to witness it. The territorial governor was a tall man with silver hair and a commanding presence. He stood on the platform next to the judge and the preacher, waiting. When Wyatt and Clara climbed the steps, the crowd fell silent. The governor spoke first, his voice carrying across the square. He talked about heroism and sacrifice, about the flood and the lives saved, about the kind of courage it took to risk everything for people who'd shown you nothing but contempt. Then he presented Wyatt with the commendation, a medal on a ribbon, simple but beautiful. "The territory recognizes Wyatt Mercer as a hero and protector of Red Hollow," the governor said. "May his example inspire us all to be better, braver, and more compassionate." The crowd erupted in applause. Wyatt stood frozen, the medal in his hands, his face a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. The judge spoke next. He read the official exoneration, a legal document that cleared Wyatt's name completely, stating for the record that he had acted in self-defense and that the accusations against him had been unfounded. He apologized on behalf of the territory for the miscarriage of justice that had shadowed Wyatt for 5 years. "This man was wrongly condemned," the judge said, his voice ringing with authority. "Today, we set the record straight. Wyatt Mercer is innocent. He always was." The applause was even louder this time, mixed with cheers. Clara saw Marcus Pritchard standing at the edge of the crowd, his face solemn but his eyes clear. He nodded once to Wyatt, and Wyatt returned the gesture. Then the preacher stepped forward with a smile. I understand we have one more piece of business today, a much happier one. The crowd murmured with curiosity. Wyatt turned to Clara and held out his hand. She took it, her heart soaring. Wyatt Mercer and Clara Voss have asked to be married today, here, in front of all of you, the preacher announced. Does anyone object? The crowd roared its approval. Someone started clapping, and soon everyone was applauding again, laughing and cheering. Clara felt tears stream down her face as Wyatt pulled her close. The ceremony itself was simple and perfect. They spoke their vows in voices that carried across the square, promises of love and loyalty, of standing together through whatever came next, of choosing each other every day for the rest of their lives. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when Wyatt kissed her, the crowd exploded with joy. Clara barely registered the rest of it. The congratulations, the handshakes, the endless stream of people wanting to wish them well. She was too busy looking at Wyatt, at the way his face had transformed from the hard, guarded mask she'd first seen in the saloon to something open and alive and unafraid. They celebrated into the evening. The town had prepared a feast, and tables groaned under the weight of food and drink. There was music and dancing, and Clara found herself swept into it, laughing as Wyatt tried to keep up despite clearly having no idea what he was doing. Ruth pulled Clara aside at one point, tears streaming down her face. You did this. You saw what he could be, and you didn't let him settle for less. Clara shook her head. He did this. I just believed in him. Sometimes that's all someone needs, someone who believes. As the sun set and lamps were lit across the square, Wyatt and Clara stood together at the edge of the celebration, watching their new life unfold around them. Deputy Marshal Wyatt Mercer, Clara said, testing the words. Has a nice ring to it. Wyatt smiled. Not as nice as Clara Mercer. Hearing her new name sent a thrill through her. No, that's definitely better. We should probably go home soon. We've got a long ride ahead. Are you eager to leave your own wedding celebration? I'm eager to start our life together, the real part. Just you and me. Clara understood. The public recognition was important. The exoneration was necessary, but what mattered most was the quiet life they'd built together in the cabin on the hill. That was home. Everything else was just noise. They said their goodbyes and rode out of town as the stars emerged overhead. The valley was beautiful at night, peaceful and vast, full of possibilities. When they reached the cabin, Wyatt dismounted and helped Clara down, then stood looking at the small structure like he was seeing it for the first time. What are you thinking? Clara asked. That this place was a tomb before you came, just walls and silence and ghosts. Now it's alive again. Clara took his hand and led him inside. The fire she'd banked that morning was still glowing softly. She built it up while Wyatt lit the lamps, and soon the cabin was warm and bright. I have something for you, Wyatt said. He crossed to the trunk at the foot of the bed and pulled out a small wooden box. I made it, not very well, but I tried. Clara took the box and opened it. Inside was a ring, simple, carved from wood and polished until it gleamed. It wasn't gold or silver or anything valuable, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. Wyatt had made it with his own scarred hands, had shaped it specifically for her. It's perfect, she whispered. Wyatt slipped it onto her finger. It fit exactly right. I know it's not much it's everything. She kissed him, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. They had promised themselves to each other in front of everyone who mattered, and now in the privacy of their home, they made those promises real in a way that was theirs alone. Later, lying together in Wyatt's bed, their bed now, Clara traced the scars on his palms. Do they still hurt? She asked. Sometimes, but they remind me of what matters, who I was fighting for. Who were you fighting for? Wyatt turned to look at her, his eyes soft in the lamplight. You. The town. Everyone who needed help, but mostly you. I kept thinking that if I could get through it, if I could save enough people, maybe I'd be worthy of you. Clara's throat tightened. Wyatt, you were always worthy. You just didn't know it yet. I know it now because you showed me. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, And Clara's last thought before sleep claimed her was that she'd never felt safer, more loved, or more certain of her place in the world. The months that followed were the happiest of Clara's life. Wyatt took his deputy marshal duties seriously, traveling to neighboring towns to help settle disputes and teach survival skills. But he always came home, usually bearing some small gift, wildflowers, a pretty stone, once a book of poetry he'd traded for in a town 3 valleys over. Clara tended the property, improved the cabin, and built relationships with the women in town who'd become her friends. She was no longer the desperate stranger who'd stepped off the train with nothing but a carpet bag and broken dreams. She was Clara Mercer, wife of the deputy marshal, a woman who'd proven she could endure anything and come out stronger. The town respected her not because of Wyatt, but because she'd earned it through her own strength and kindness. Spring came, and with it the first shoots in the garden Clara had planted with seeds from Ruth. The chickens produced more eggs than they could eat, so Clara started selling them in town. Wyatt built an addition onto the cabin, a real bedroom, so they could have privacy and eventually, maybe, fill it with the children they'd started talking about in quiet moments. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the mountains gold, Clara thought about how far they'd both come. From the broken, bitter woman and the isolated, condemned man they'd been to this, a marriage built on mutual respect and hard-won trust, a home filled with warmth and possibility, a future that stretched out bright and open before them. "What are you thinking about?" Wyatt asked, his arm around her shoulders. "About that first night, when I stopped you in the saloon and asked for help. I was so desperate, so afraid." "So was I. I just hid it better." Clara smiled. "You gave me everything I needed. Safety, work, a chance to prove myself. You saved my life. And you gave me back mine." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade. Somewhere in the valley, a coyote called. The wind carried the scent of pine and new grass. Everything felt exactly as it should. "I love you," Clara said. "I love you too." It was the simplest truth in a world full of complicated ones. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Years later, when people asked Clara to tell the story of how she and Wyatt found each other, she would smile and say it wasn't a fairy tale. There was no magic, no destiny, no force guiding them together. Just 2 broken people who refused to give up, who chose to see the good in each other when the rest of the world saw only flaws, who built something real and lasting out of desperation and hope and sheer stubborn determination. She would tell them about the flood that nearly destroyed Red Hollow, but ended up saving it. About the man everyone feared who turned out to be the bravest person any of them had ever known. About the woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. About the way love could grow in the hardest soil if you tended it carefully enough. And she would tell them that the ruthless cowboy became a protector, the discarded bride found her home, and together they proved that redemption wasn't given. It was earned, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one act of courage at a time. In the end, that was the only story that mattered. Not the flood, or the fear, or the years of injustice. Just 2 people who loved each other and built a life worth living in a valley that had tried to break them both. They survived. They thrived. And they lived happily, not because they were perfect, but because they were perfect for each other. The story of Clara and Wyatt Mercer became the kind of legend that got passed down through generations in Red Hollow. Not as a tale of tragedy overcome, but as proof that sometimes the most unlikely people find each other at exactly the right moment. And when they do, they can change not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. And every word of it was true.